Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, and welcome back to the Koala podcast. And I've got a part two. Evan Mills, who I spoke to a few weeks back, who wrote a report on energy consumption and the cannabis industry, both legal and illegal, if you want to call it that. He wrote this fascinating report that was skimmed over a bit on the social medias, but since I last spoke to him, he just said that more media, podcasts, and general media have picked up on what he's talking about, which is fantastic to hear. In the last podcast, we sort of just talked about the issues, what the problems were when it started, and I thought in this second and part of the conversation to sort of think about fast forwarding to now, what Evan thinks some of the solutions might be, and finally how he might see a wonderful imaginary Woody Allen sleeper view of the future of how we manage producing these crops and how we manage the energy consumption in the process of doing so. Evan, thanks for coming back and talking to me again. Great to hear that these other people are talking to you. Who have you been talking to, and in what way are they interested?
I think, some of the larger newspapers and other podcasters, some industry interest, some students, getting calls from students,
great.
which is,
That's
graduate students who are putting together dissertations or projects on it, the next wave of people to carry the torch on analysis. It's, I don't know, they're interested in how did we get here? That question, which you and I also talked about, and nice to be back, by the way. And it's a colorful story. It's not a simple answer. There's a lot of moving parts. And then, why is this not optimized? Why is it's not rational? Why is it not energy efficient? What are the imperfections? Why is what's gotten in the way of a more rational configuration in terms of energy, environmental footprint of cannabis? And then the future, they're interested, like you are, and people are encouraged to hear that there are things to do. One of the lazy people on LinkedIn said TLDR, too long didn't read. Learned that from my kids. And it stinks,
I didn't know that one, so that's good. I know
Yeah.
Sigma and those sorts of things, but I didn't know that one.
Yeah, TLDR and TLDR, and it stinks because there's no solutions, and so too long, the 150 word summary is too long and to read, or what exactly? And then it's full of solutions. But so people are interested in the solutions, whether they know it or not, or whether they have the energy to absorb them or not. Yeah.
So, look, in the last conversation, we were sort of having a chronological discussion. We only got as far as about 2017. I don't think we need to do that. We sort of know how we got here. So let's fast forward from, say, 2017-18 to now. Let's first talk about where we are now compared to, say, then. Have there been any improvements in thought? And then we can talk about how we start to create solutions. So where are we now, and is it worse than it was when we ended the last conversation?
You mean from the mid 2010s to now, in essence, in the last decade?
Yeah.
No, unfortunately, I think it is worse in the sense of absolute emissions, and also the kind of average energy intensity of a given unit of product, because consumption continues to trend in the indoor direction. So it's just intrinsically more energy and carbon intensive because outdoor is only, a few percent of the footprint of indoor. And then consumption continues to grow among the public, and so the absolute aggregate emissions are higher. And the facilities, you could also argue that the industry just keeps inventing new ways to use energy. And I'm not, tongue in cheek, I'm not saying that's the goal at all, but I think like with overproduction, there's more and more use of refrigeration and freezing, which sounds kind of benign, but really when you have, tons and tons of product held for months and months, if not years and years in that mode, it adds up. And also, maybe just to round it out, the trend that's also going on in uh, demand from pure flour or raw flour to derivative goods is also driving energy use and energy intensity up, because all those
Okay.
processes after harvest are non-trivially energy intensive. We know the least about them, and that's really a crying shame that there's virtually no literature, analysis, or public information. I mean, I'm sure individual companies or equipment
Yeah,
manufacturers
like we
know.
discussed last time, the only people who really would know would be the energy companies if they knew where that energy source was
E-
being used from. But I presume they don't, because
Right.
it's a warehouse in an industrial estate that
Yeah, and
could
it's not
be.
broken down, so
Yeah.
you have this facility and out comes an energy bill, and things aren't, we call, sub-metered, or at least not sub-billed, and so yeah, so it's almost it's hardly helpful to have a
And
total energy
a
bill
lot of those
often.
businesses, when I start looking at them in terms of trying to understand their legal structure, or
Mm,
or who is on the board,
mm,
when things go wrong, they're
mm.
normally dressed up as another company doing something else. So they're virtually impossible to identify the mass of them, aren't they?
Yeah, in fact, this kind of riffs off what you just said, but also your previous question about trends in the last decade. So one of the trends that I think is, and then it leads to this opacity, corporate opacity, is of urbanization of cannabis production. So cities, I'm sure, not just in the U.S., but where it's legalized, are interested in selling permits and licenses and having economic activity and having jobs and having ways to employ previously incarcerated people. There's a whole bouquet of reasons, but cities have definitely courted cannabis in large ways. City of Oakland has something called the Green Zone, and it's a 10-mile long swath of land right along the San Francisco Bay, which is where cannabis industrial factory farm facilities are allowed to be licensed and permitted to be built. And that has brought some unpleasant things in Oakland. Gets to your comment about corporate structure in Oakland. Some investors from out of state came in. They borrowed $50 million from the bank, 50 million, and bought two giant historic warehouses in these neighborhoods, which happened to be also uh, the most non-white, lowest income, and highest uh, call a environmental overburden on the people. So emissions from paint factories, freeways, train tracks, uh, public, buses and things, air quality and water quality and things being particularly bad compared to what people in other zip codes or other parts of the city experience. So, long story, slightly less long, built out their cannabis operation, blew out, turned the lights on, literally blew out the local utility grid because there had been no effort to see whether the electrical service from the utility was adequate to support, I think, 12,000 amps of power to people. And they immediately brought in, well, gradually over a short period of time, but they ended up bringing in 12 tractor trailer sized diesel generators. These are like the long lorries you see on the highway, each one producing 1 million watts of power. So they had 12 of them humming along, and they broke every law imaginable doing this, but were allowed to do it for 2 years before finally being shut down. And they were at the peak, they were burning 6,000 gallons of diesel fuel a day, with low income, mostly non-white artists living upstairs in the second floor. It was an artist loft of great renown, actually, going back to the 1970s, and they tried to evict these people. So environmental justice, I wrote an article in Slate, people can look up, called Environmental Justice Up in Smoke about this. But to your point, I think that detour is useful just because these are some things that are more indicative of the last decade than the decade before. And they're not the norm, and I'm not saying this is happening every day, but it's kind of par for the course of the kind of free for all that it's been. At any rate, so these companies, it just evaporated. I mean, there were layer and layer and layer of shell companies on top of shell companies. They didn't materialize for hearings. The property went back to the bank. The bank is now trying to sell it to other cannabis entrepreneurs.
No, look, I
So
just
that
reported on a company who had released a very short press release in Germany yesterday, and they're getting out of the cannabis industry because there's a new government in Germany, and they obviously
mm,
think it's not favorable, and they doing the equivalent of a Chapter 11, but at the
mm,
same time, I think it seems as though having a quick look that they're going to retain it, but sell off a whole lot of stuff, take the word cannabis and apply, and this is happening all over the world, and you don't know what they're doing, and especially as you say, these new products are developed, they get further and further away from agriculture. And so they just become part of the industrial process. And you don't know, as you say, you can't measure if you can't measure don't know what industry is, you can't measure what that industry is using, can you?
yeah, exactly.
Is this just growing and growing and growing, to use a bad pun?
Well, I think there's certainly, like with anything that grows, especially as exponentially, it runs into friction just for any, laws of nature, laws of natural limits that are on things. And so, the industry is certainly struggling under its energy expense burden and its capital burden, because so much of the capital in these facilities is for energy using equipment. If that's speaking to what you're asking, I think there is some pause, and of course, with collapse in retail prices, we might have touched on last time, it makes that squeeze. It's one
And
thing if
can
you're
they not be forced through there? It's a new industry, or the parts that we can recognize
mm,
can, and that look, I don't understand the nuts and bolts of how these can operate in the US, but you're you in the conversation with me, you're essentially saying that a lot of the control on how they operate comes from local authorities. How about renewables? They don't. It seems to me, for an industry that's all green and beautiful and everybody's supposed to weed and they sit there and everybody's happy and all this sort of stuff, that I don't see any discussion ever of using renewables to fund the growth and production of these products. You're in
mhm.
California, you should be at the vanguard of these conversations. Is that
Mm.
conversation even happening?
It does, and in various degrees of integrity. The operators that I just mentioned, who were running the diesel generators, they were advertising their product, or one of them. It was actually like an industrial park with 10 different producers under the roof. One of them at least was advertising their product as 100% renewable energy grown.
Well, you dig it out of the
It,
ground, it's renewable.
yeah, we can
They're
get
in their
more. We
mind.
can get
It's a bit
more,
like
so it's renewable.
equity. We've
Yeah,
got we've
but
got
again, that's not the norm.
yeah.
So more seriously, sure, it goes way back, and like in California, the folklore is that, well, the solar industry here was kicked off by back to the landers, many of whom were cannabis growers, and they were off grid and they needed solar, and it was really to run their blenders to make smoothies. I love smoothies, but it wasn't to run 1,000-watt lights, in which they weren't even using at the time. But that said, the renewable energy, uh, movement, trend, industry is certainly correlated with cannabis directly, indirectly. But more recently and at scale, some of the regulators have tried to say, well, you have to purchase all green power. So there have been efforts we're talking like at city scale or county scale, local jurisdiction, trying to deal with it in that way. There's 12
And do
different
they have to
problems
pay
with that,
more
but
for green power?
it's usually a bit more. Yeah, it's like 10% more. It varies, but there's bigger problems than that. It sounds so nice, but it
Yeah.
doesn't. We can touch on it briefly. But so there's that, and then the problem. I mean, the big inconvenient truth is that the energy intensity is, well, two things. One is that these facilities aren't necessarily all electric. So a lot of them are using natural gas or fuel for heating, space heating, water heating. CO2 generation is sometimes done by burning fossil fuel. That's less and less of a thing, but used to be the norm. CO2 generation for carbon fertilization, so you get higher yields, is very common in this industry and
Yeah.
other indoor agriculture. So if you're going solar, you're just getting the electricity part. You're not touching the other. But if you are all electric and you try to go solar, here's the inconvenient truth: you need I've just run a bunch of numbers. You need between, 20 or 30 times your roof area and 100 times, 200 times even your roof area in solar. So you cannot do net zero, true net zero emissions on site. Uh, there isn't the footprint. You could, if you're in a rural area, and in principle, you could buy all this surrounding land, but that would never pencil. It's not going to happen. So with you see solar companies advertising. There's even one cannabis company. It's called Solar Cannabis, and they don't use solar energy. It's just they just like the word. But there are a lot of examples you can find out there of cannabis industrial warehouse grows that have PV on the roof, but they're getting 5% of their energy need from it. They're
It's
very happy and
PR
they
and
love to
branding more
photograph
than
it.
anything else, isn't it?
Yeah, and they're saving a buck,
Yeah.
maybe or whatever. And it's just that without being cynical, there's you run up against this wall of space. And by the way, if you did have all that land, you would be having a much larger land use footprint with solar than if you grew outdoors. So the whole, that's one of the top
Well,
five
that was my other
arguments, right,
question
for indoor
is this
cultivation
balance
is that you save
between
land.
indoor and outdoor? Because obviously indoor you can grow a lot more in a smaller space, but outdoor you have to use more space. And that's also affects the environment
Absolutely.
and takes away from other crops that actually feed people or not
Or
that
wildland,
or wildland exactly
or you could build
natural.
parking lots
So
on
I
it.
mean
Yeah, there's a lot of other uses.
so
Yeah,
there's so many moving parts. I mean, does it
yeah.
in the end mean that cannabis has to produce less and charge more and be taxed less by the state? Because at the moment, people still pay a lot for the cannabis, and mainly because it's a bit like cigarettes in around many places in the world, where the state or local think, oh, this is a great way. Then we can throw 100 grand at a school, and that'll get us some votes or whatever. Uh, there's lots of moving parts. We need to use less energy. That what in your head of looking at it for 20 years now, how do we start to manage these solutions and make people understand that solutions have to come? It's obviously everything is always step by step, but this industry's raced forward so fast and become so industrial so quickly. How do we control and manage that in terms of energy use?
Like with any energy problem and most other problems, there's never a silver bullet. So it's a constellation of things, and that doesn't mean it's not an evasive answer. It's just like you need a bouquet of flowers here. And fortunately, there are, lots of things that can be done and lots of things that are done and are tried. And, the energy use would be even worse than it is today if not for LED lights, if not for more efficient heat pumps and things that are being used. So there's kind of, there's several tracks. There's energy efficiency, there is renewable energy, so use less, have it be cleaner, and then there's kind of, to say it in a kind of academic way, there's process change, if you will. And so energy efficiency is, I mean, these are technical, not policy, points, and then we can
Yeah.
talk about because that's more what
The
you're
technical
interested in,
points
right? Is
become policy points
yeah,
once people
and they're
understand them.
a starting point for
Yeah.
those. Yeah. So energy efficiency, there's tons that can be done. There's tons that have been tried, and there's no
Do we
new.
know what works?
Well, everything works a little bit, but nothing works enough. I mean, LED lights save energy. How much they save depends. We might have talked last time. If you look at Figure 5 in my paper, some strains don't respond well to LED light. They don't, meaning in term, they don't use any or much less energy per kilogram. Others respond a lot. If you use LED light, you might use more space heating, but use less cooling. It's complicated, but they certainly work. Insulation works, better heating equipment works. These things all work, but we don't see large percentage reductions in the facility level. And meanwhile, like sometimes energy efficiency gets turned into more production. Like we saw that actually in this site that I mentioned with the diesel generators. They got LED lights that were even brighter then the halogen lights, they were
So let's
sorry,
just
the
produce more for
yeah.
because we're spending the same amount of
Yeah,
money.
yeah. And that's called the take back effect. And it's usually the darling, actually, of the climate deniers. So I'm not a big take back effect person. And it's very subtle. And people want to say, well, energy efficiency doesn't save any energy. And I'm not that person. And that's not that simple. And it doesn't, it doesn't just end there. But there is that dynamic. When you have brighter light, you get more yield. So are you using more energy per kilogram or just more energy per footprint? So it's complicated. But there definitely are ways in which, a lot of ways in which intensifying indoor agriculture, whether it's cucumbers, tomatoes, or cannabis, results in less efficiency, meaning more energy per unit yield. So a little bit of a sidetrack there. But so there's energy efficiency. Well, I think one of the big things there is that, when people have surveyed systematically growers about, because this costs money, right? So what's your payback time? What's your hurdle rate? How long are you willing to wait to get your capital investment in the LED lights, et cetera, back? And the average answer is like 4 years or less, meaning I want 25% return on my money. Boy, I wish I could get that.
Yeah.
And many people will say zero, saying like, I don't have any extra cash flow. As long as it cash flows right away, I'll do it. And there's some things like that because there's so many things that are unoptimized that you can fix. We call it building commissioning. It's kind of quality assurance that's just brains, not fan belts, in buildings. But 4 years payback time isn't going to get you anywhere near, an optimized energy efficiency. So energy efficiency is there. It should be done. Uh, People should convert from fuel to electricity and then get clean electricity. Those are things that can be done and should be done. They just don't, get us to the goal we need to be at. And then renewables, we kind of talked about already. It's there, but it has constraints and real limits. And by the way, plugging into a clean grid, renewable grid, is not without cost. The literature is full of uncomfortable articles about, and I'm a huge fan of renewables, don't get me wrong, but it's like waste not, want not, and there's ecological disruption. There's, like you mentioned, competing with food. There's, you're unwilding land. You're incurring a big cost. You're using land, and their cultural that's what the other thing I was trying to think of. People want to build these large solar arrays on Native American lands. You probably have the same issues in Australia. And it's not barren land, remote land, wasted
It looks
land,
like a
unused
desert,
land.
therefore
Yeah.
that's
And so,
pretty
so
17th century thinking.
yeah, and which we still seem really good at. And so just trying to pawn this off on, well, we'll clean the grid and plug into that grid, especially it doesn't work. And especially when you have other competing, also growing demands like AI, like data centers more broadly, like electric cars, like electrifying fossil fuel, all those things, not all of them, but let's say the electrification of existing fuel for carbon reductions should be the number one priority, right? That's that in the loading order societally. If we're talking about energy policy and we're talking about getting out of climate problem, then the last thing you want to be doing is creating new electrical loads that are discretionary. Come back to that when we haven't met the existing mission critical, electric loads. We need to have hospitals be indoors that are using electricity. We need more or less for schools. Some people argue, but schools indoors, we need to sleep indoors generally. So I know you're with your koalas, you like sleep in trees.
We
I
love
think
sleeping
you're
in trees,
telling
yeah.
me. It's wonderful. It's a very green thing to do, but seriously, so to have these new loads come along is very, very problematic. Even when we're not building renewables fast enough. We're doing great, but we're not getting emissions. We have a climate emergency, by the way. So the speed with which we substitute fossil for with renewable in electricity is very important. So if we're bringing in new loads, we're just slowing down this process. So that's kind of efficiency in renewables. And then the exciting one is process change. And that means like I'm looking at indoor agriculture more broadly, and like there's people in the East, like in Iran and Turkey, and they're growing greenhouses when it's growing cucumbers in greenhouses when it's 120 outside. Big problem to keep those plants alive in a greenhouse, right, with the sun coming through the roof. So they're cooling, instead of air conditioning all the air, they're cooling the root zones with chilled water in the growing media, and it's much, much, much less energy. Just saying, like, this isn't cannabis, but that's an example, kind of a process change. Other people who are growing strawberries indoors, which is quite a thing now, it's the main fruit that's grown indoors in controlled
Yeah,
agriculture.
well, I mean, Kenya and places like that. I mean, that's how the UK, that's where all their strawberries come from.
Yeah,
All
and they're
that
greenhouse
Wimbledon stuff
grown.
is actually Kenyan rather than
But are they greenhouse grown in Kenya? Is that what you're
I
saying?
think they are these days, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In Southeast Asia, there's a bunch of
Yeah.
papers. So one thing they're figuring out is that we can like keep the plants outside while they're leafing and growing their runners, and then we can wheel them into the greenhouse for the fruiting stage. And it's like, it sounds kind of boring, but like this is makes a big dent in the energy footprint. So for cannabis, there can be things like that, like strain choice, cultivar, is a huge difference, like a factor of, I think my paper showed a factor of 6 difference in energy use per kilogram depending on the genetics, more to the real. But then it goes the other way too, that there'll be a cultivar that comes along that everybody loves and it's using twice as much energy.
Yeah.
So this is a really slippery slope and an area that doesn't get studied and is kind of out of sight, out of mind. I mean, I think the cultivators know because they're experimenting with a lot of cultivars and they see the differences. But the thing is, like, to bring it home, is outdoor cultivation. And that's the process change that is so elegant, so cost effective, saves operating costs. Your product will sell for less because, right or wrong, like that's how the markets are. I mean, that's a whole question there. That's a very odd thing, that the differential is like a factor of 2, at least here in North America. But outdoor, so in my study, the we looked at a lot. I looked at a lot of different knobs that could be turned. So outdoor cultivation, a shift to that just as a thought experiment, full shift to that as a thought experiment, will reduce the national carbon footprint by 76%. And what's remaining is the transportation energy and the carbon, which is a separate problem, and the carbon in the fertilizer and the CO2 making and stuff like that. You can attack that too, but just where you cultivate. Conversely, like if you go to full electrification, and you electrify everything and you make it energy efficient, that saves about 10%. If you go to all solar, just wave the wand and say we have all the land we need and money, prices, no object, that'll save 30%. And then, by the way, legalization, huge question. Like how would legalization affect
Well,
energy
that
use?
creates, unfortunately,
8%.
we're almost out of time because that creates a whole lot of other questions, because
Yeah.
I'm going to get you in 6 months' time because I know you're busy at the moment, but because I wanted to talk about a couple of things. Is like, should people be prepared to pay for cannabis like they pay for a nice wine? Will home grow encourage people to use less energy at home or more energy at home?
It's less.
It is less, is it? So that's
Yes. It's
interesting.
one finding, quite a
Okay.
bit less.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm gonna annoy you and come back to you in a few months' time and have those discussions, maybe about talking about legalization across the country and what policy could do or force states to do to try and deindustrialize
Yeah.
cannabis.
Quick, I would say quick, just take home there at the highest level is that there are distortions in the current market that make it, in many cases, more favorable and lucrative to grow indoors. And so I think policymakers make it a level playing field. We all talk about that as a sacred thing and we want the markets to work. So be sure that the incentives are not preferential towards indoor, which they are now in many cases, and you might even tip it the other way if that's a public goal. Why should an indoor grower get $1 million check from their utility for